Today, we are fortunate to have the authors of a new book, Shattered Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign, which is a best-selling book right now. It's the #1 book on the New York Times bestseller list. And the authors are two terrific journalists, Jonathan Allen, who now is heading the content for Sidewire and writes a column for Roll Call. And he's the recipient of the Dirksen and Hume Awards and has written about national politics for other outlets as well, including Bloomberg and Politico. And Amie Parnes, to my right, who is a senior White House correspondent for The Hill, where she has been covering Hillary Clinton for a while. Both of them wrote another book, and I had them here for that, about Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State. And we were just talking a little earlier today during a podcast that I remember when they were here then, and they said they were going to write a book about Hillary Clinton's campaign. I didn't know how dramatic that would end up being. But boy, was I wrong. So I'm going to talk to them a little bit about the book, and then we're going to have time for questions and answers. So please welcome John and Amie. All right, so why don't we start with the question that's on everyone's mind. Who is Robbie Mook?
Oh, you're looking at me.
Either one, because I'm in the middle.
Robbie Mook was the manager of Hillary Clinton's campaign, and a relatively young guy in his 30s, who had worked in Democratic politics for a while, worked for President Obama's re-election effort, had worked for Hillary Clinton in 2008. And he's the guy who won the sweepstakes to be Hillary Clinton's campaign manager in 2016. Second prize was being campaign manager in 2016 and 2020.
And why does Hillary Clinton decide that he should be so central to the campaign?
So he had served on her 2008 campaign. He led the Nevada caucus run and was successful there, but he worked for Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia. He sought to get him elected. He did. He was recommended by Terry McAuliffe, and I think that's why Terry McAuliffe is obviously very close to the Clintons, so they went with it.
So at the heart of the book is a look back at this campaign and what went wrong. It's origins from inside the campaign rather than from a perspective looking out, and he's one of the figures, and in the primaries against Bernie Sanders and in the general campaign, he's often in conflict with other parts of the Clinton campaign. Can either of you tell me, or maybe John, a little bit about who are some of the players who had a different look at politics than the analytically driven Robbie Mook?
So one of the reasons Mook got this job is that Hillary Clinton had thought in 2008 that Barack Obama had run circles around her in terms of modern campaigning, in terms of technology, in terms of the use of data. And Mook was somebody who was familiar with these things, respected them, as it turned out, perhaps a little bit too much, but he was convinced that he could find efficiencies in all sorts of things through data that he was getting about the electorate, in terms of where they broadcast ads, where Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton went to campaign, in terms of whether they should try to turn out voters who supported her already or try to persuade voters who didn't already agree with her. And so he sort of came from this sort of new school of believing in data as a determinant in campaigns. He went up against President Clinton, who believed that the campaign should be doing more to try to persuade voters who did not agree with Hillary Clinton to come to her side. He clashed heavily with John Podesta, though a lot of that was, as much as that was about substance, it was also about style. Podesta, the campaign chairman, who is roughly 70 years old and was a former Clinton White House chief of staff, is very aggressive. Mook is very passive aggressive, and these sort of two styles were really not well suited for each other. And then Mook also had to contend with these longtime Hillary Clinton aides, many of whom worked at the State Department, Huma Abedin, Jake Sullivan, Philippe Reines, all these people that were giving her advice that she had listened to for a number of years on a variety of things, not to mention the sort of larger Clinton world, people that had worked with her and her husband for like 25 years. Basically, he was put in the spot of trying to run a campaign that didn't have, for a candidate who didn't have a lot of structure around her to begin with. Had 1 million people contacting her, but not a lot of structure.
And John didn't just come up with the words passive, aggressive, and aggressive. These are words that were actually lobbed at one another by both gentlemen. Robbie thought that Podesta could be a jerk, and Podesta thought that Robbie was passive aggressive, and they exchanged words. They actually go off to a senior retreat in the summer of '16 where they call each other these names in front of a room full of other advisors.
And you have a great story about trying to write her announcement that she's running. And the challenges the writers had. Could you tell everyone a little bit about what you reported on that?
So Secretary Clinton had launched her campaign officially, but sort of unofficially, kind of unofficially, she wanted to do a more official speech in Roosevelt Island in New York. So she calls together a bunch of outside advisors. She's working with consultants and a speechwriter inside. She calls in President Obama's longtime speechwriter, John Favreau, and they're all more than a dozen people working on this one speech, which is pretty rare in politics. When you have a speech, you usually have a speechwriter and maybe an advisor and the principal. So there are all these people working on her speech. They can't cull together a message. They're struggling so much that John Favreau, Obama's speechwriter, kind of leaves in the middle of it, throws his hands up, and goes to Europe. And so the basic point was that, as one person told us, it sounded like your boilerplate Democratic stump speech. It wasn't specific to her, and that was how the campaign got started.
And then in the middle of this primary, here comes Bernie Sanders. Takes everyone, all of us were watching, and he mounts a challenge that everyone thought was impossible. What was going on in this divided campaign that you write about as Sanders starts to show that his campaign has legs? How do they respond?
They really didn't see him coming. And I think the Clintons' instinct when they started to see him coming was kill it, kill it. You know, I mean, this is their basic instinct is get rid of the opponent. But the campaign management team, the strategists and consultants and the campaign manager, they all thought that there was a really good chance that would backfire. That Hillary Clinton was already, like there were already so many negative attributes associated with Secretary Clinton that if she went out and hit Bernie Sanders, whose message was largely just a more liberal version, right? That if she went out and hit him and did the things it would take to destroy him, backfire on her. And so they tried to hold her back and tried to hold her back. And you see that throughout the campaign, her trying every once in a while to punch a little harder, and the campaign saying, come back, come back. And so she, they basically let him get the jump on her in Iowa. He almost wins Iowa. He wins New Hampshire by 22 points. If he had put together even the tie in Iowa, 22 points in New Hampshire and a Nevada win, Nevada was pretty close. We write about this in the book. You could see him just taking off. They could see him potentially just taking off. There was huge concern there. And so it's interesting, while a lot of people point to different points in the primary as to when things changed and when she really took hold, her folks actually say the Nevada caucus, which was the third state on the calendar, was like the firewall. It ended up being her firewall. So she ends up winning that. Then she goes to South Carolina, wins by a lot, and she's sort of off to the races. But they were very, very concerned through the majority of February about the possibility of Bernie Sanders just kind of taking off, and they didn't really have an answer to it.
And what, in the end, you guys write about a strategy that takes hold to defeat him, and it's a strategy that will have long-term consequences for the Democratic campaign. What was that?
Well, at the same time, Bernie Sanders is coming at her hard, and he is basically making the argument that Hillary Clinton has been speaking to big banks and that she, that she's in the middle of this, that she is in the pocket of big banks essentially, and it's dovetailing with Donald Trump's message of crooked Hillary. And so her campaign comes at him. They can't quite put him away. John, do you want to talk about Part B?
So, the other thing that and maybe this is what you're getting at a little bit, if you look at the way the Democratic primary system is structured and the way they win delegates, and this is probably not for this room, but it's complicated math for a lot of people. Basically, you are better off in a Democratic primary running up the score in big cities because you get more delegates out of more populated areas that perform better for Democrats. There's probably a cleaner way of saying that. In fact, I think the book does. But ultimately, you're better off running up the score in cities, which typically ends up meaning that you're better off running up the score among African American and Latino voters. We saw with President Obama in 2008 with the combination of a united African American base and a portion of the white vote did for him. Hillary Clinton basically ran that campaign again in 2016. So she focused, in order to win the delegates she needed to win the nomination, focused heavily on African American voters, focused heavily on Latino voters, ran up the score in those areas, and as a result, started to alienate working class white voters. At least that's what her campaign concluded was going on during the primary, and something that ended up hurting her in the general too, that the more she focused on her base and the less she focused on persuasion outside of it, the more that became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and she focused on a narrower and narrower base and more alienated these working class white voters in some of the key battleground states.
And Bill Clinton keeps sounding the alarm. He's so frustrated and angry because he's hearing a different kind of tone when he's out on the trail, and he's saying, something's not right here, something feels amiss. And he keeps telling Robbie Mook, there's a problem here, we're not addressing our base. And so in a way, you see Bill Clinton popping up time and again in the book as this guy who is saying that things aren't going as planned, and we should be doing something different.
And when did the damn emails, as Bernie Sanders called them, come into the story?
Well, it haunted her from the very beginning. In fact, a month out, she is having to answer what the email controversy, she's having to go on defense. And you'll recall at the UN, there she is having to talk about it. She launches her campaign a month later, and she's still talking about it 6 months later. And she's frustrated at the same time because her message isn't getting across. And she and her husband on one call are so frustrated and so angry at her aides, and they're saying, why isn't our economic message breaking through? Get it straight, let's get this right. Her aides are frustrated because they've been trying to get her to come out in front of it, but she and the former president feel like they've done nothing wrong. So they think that they're in the right and that they shouldn't have to apologize for it. And finally, in September, so we're talking 6 months later, she apologizes, and it takes her then a few times to get the apology right. She starts in one interview and she doesn't really do a clean swipe of that, and then she goes back and does it. Finally, with David Muir of ABC News, she finally apologizes and gets out kind of in front of it, although it's 6 months later.
I think if you think about this, the cloud of the email scandal lasts from March of 2015, when the New York Times and AP first report on it, all the way until Election Day. And there's never really a point where it entirely goes away. It's background music at some points, and it's right in the foreground at other points. It's a huge part of the explanation for why voters who didn't see her as dishonest coming into this election saw her as dishonest during this election.
Do you think she and her campaign understood how the media worked? Because there's obviously one explanation that in the end they didn't. They didn't get why this would be a scandal. They didn't understand how this would be played. They didn't understand the differences that she would be, how she would be characterized, or how the news cycle worked. Like, what's your impression after being embedded in some ways in this campaign of her, not just her advisors, but how they understood the era of internet cable news?
She had to tweak her when she saw Donald Trump. That was a really interesting storyline to me because they were so used to planning everything out. And he spoke from the gut and could do things at a moment's notice. And they had to kind of tweak, especially going into the general, their approach to media. They couldn't just plan an interview. She suddenly was calling into shows, much like he was doing. And so I think they took a different approach going into the general, but it took them a while to kind of to get there. Mm-hmm. And she's never been a fan of the press. She's never proactively had to reach out to them. Her press team goes on defense. That's how they're trained. And so I think that that was sort of part of it.
What do you mean they go on defense?
You know, she doesn't have to reach out in the traditional way of getting people to come to an event. It's Hillary Clinton, she's there. But I think that they're always ready for something, something to be lobbed against her or some criticism or the email controversy is a really good example, but I think they're always ready for the next big thing and what they need to be prepared for. So I think that hurts her in a way.
I also think that, her husband is so good at the contrition cycle, so good at I'm so sorry I broke that thing in the living room, and I'm so sorry, and I'll never do it again. And he gets the whole thing that people want to seek, and the media wants contrition. And they want it more from her, and maybe that's sexist, but they do. They want contrition. They want to see her say I'm sorry. They want to know she learned her lesson. Whatever. I know what I'm saying right now sounds sexist as it comes out of my mouth, but it's the truth, and they want to see it. And she won't give them the satisfaction, and it becomes a thing with her where she's not going to give her opponents the satisfaction of hearing her say she's sorry. And her husband would apologize for stuff he didn't do to get the political benefit from it. And I think, I think this is, I think this is a part and parcel of that question about the media. That the media is, in its best and worst senses, the media are the people that see the politicians for who they are before everyone else does. So we spend more time with them, and it's not that you won't come to the same conclusion that we do. We're just usually a week or two ahead or 6 weeks ahead, just because we spend more time with them. And I think that often, so the reaction of the media to a politician is not a terrible way to judge how the average person is. Everybody's like, oh, the media is an elite bubble. And the Washington media come from all over the country. Their families are from all over the country. And while they can be in a bubble, I think that sometimes they are a reasonably good sounding board for what is wanted by the rest of the country, what people want to hear. And the answer with her for the email situation and many other things was they wanted to hear her say she was sorry, and she just didn't do it. And when she did it, it wasn't convincing enough. And maybe there was nothing she could have said that was convincing enough, but whatever it was she did say didn't hit that mark.
And I don't think in the beginning they thought that it would have been that big a deal. And you see that in some of the emails that were released. There was a speechwriter or an advisor who asked if there should be a joke made about it at an early speech that Secretary Clinton was going to give. You see an email between Podesta and Robbie exchanged, Robbie Mook, that basically one asks the other, did you think this Time story was going to be as big? I think they thought it was going to be something maybe like a 1 day or 2 day news cycle event, and that it wouldn't kind of take over the campaign initially.
And when we reach the summer and the Democrats have their convention, which seems very tame compared to the Republican convention, what's going on behind the scenes as the Democrats meet?
Well, so you have Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is a problem on day one because of the entire controversy that's surrounding her. And then you have the Bernie Sanders people that they're worried about on the floor, making the delegates, they're worried about them causing a ruckus and kind of disrupting what should be this coming together moment. So you have this elaborate plan put into place by Secretary Clinton's people and Senator Sanders' people that they arrange a text message kind of service where they're texting each other where the problem areas are around the arena. At one point during Secretary Clinton's nomination speech, you see American flags being waved and you hear chants of USA. Everything was done to mask what was happening. And they all put this in place, together and what's funny is at the very end of this one chapter, you see someone comes up to Robbie Mook and says, "Oh, it looked so great," and he thinks in his head, "It looked great, but it really wasn't. If only they knew what was happening behind the scenes, they wouldn't think this at all."
In fact, I think a lot of this book is the sort of upstairs, downstairs, if you will, or the behind the curtain, in front of the curtain, behind the curtain. We take you through things that you remember from the campaign and tell you what was going on behind the scenes, and you start to see just how dysfunctional a lot of this was, and just what some of the problems were that were bedeviling Clinton that put her in a position to lose to Donald Trump, who ran, a less than perfect campaign.
And I could tell you it's a very hard book to put down. I binge read it, if that's a term. And it's partly the function of learning and seeing behind the scenes of things that you're familiar with. One thing that struck me with your book is you really don't start the fall campaign until page, I think, 300 or 312. Meaning a lot of the book is about the primaries, it's about the decision to run. Why do you think that the fall campaign ended up having less room than you might think in the overall story?
So there are a couple of reasons. Number one, we've been working on this book for a couple of years. And then after the election, we jammed to get it done. So that probably has something to do with it. We also thought that it was important, from a reader's perspective, to kind of pick up speed at the end. And I think that it does. I think when you're reading those final chapters, you really kind of cruise through to the end. And then we do a TikTok of election night that is the first sort of behind the scenes look at what was going on in her hotel suite that night. But the other reason, I think some of the pages before 300 are in that transition period, that the convention and some of the setup for the general election. But there was a lot of stuff that happened in this campaign that set the stage for what happens at the end. And there are really only, in any general presidential election, if you think about it, the general is basically, because August is kind of a lost month with people on vacation and everything, you're really talking about September, October, early November for a general election. Some of that stuff is going on in July and August. It's a much shorter piece of what goes on. And there are really we only see them against each other, the candidates, in those 3 debates. Right. I mean, that's it. And then there are other issues that come up, the Russian involvement, the Comey letter, things like that. But it's basically a pretty condensed piece of what we watched for a couple of years.
And I think one of our biggest takeaways was that Bernie did leave a major dent on her campaign. And it's funny, you're at this chapter right now that's called "It's So Phony." You see, even after he has endorsed her, he's sitting to cut an ad for her, and he's reading the script, and at the end of the script, he has to say, "I'm with her," and he stops and says, "I can't say this, it's so phony." And I think that explains that even he was having a hard time coming around, and even though he had to publicly support her, what he was going through and what many of his supporters were going through. A lot of them never came home and never supported her. And I think that's why we devoted so much to the Sanders part of it, because you see, we lay the groundwork, even in Michigan, when she's frustrated in the primary, that she feels like they couldn't win in Michigan, and she's kind of letting her aides have it, and she's wondering what happened. And we kind of tease that out to foreshadow that they could have fixed this. This was a huge problem going into the general election, and they never went back and did anything about it. And I think that was why we did that.
And the kicker, by the way, on that Bernie Sanders "so phony" story is really good. We're not going to give away everything, but what happens after that's good too.
And by the way, soon I'm going to open the floor to questions, so start thinking in succinct fashion of what you would like to ask, and we'll get to that soon. One of the kind of moments in the campaign people remember, and they have different perspectives, is when she referred to Donald Trump's backers as deplorable, basket of deplorables. Where did that speech come from, and how did the campaign deal with the aftermath?
Well, She had apparently said it one time before that. I think it was something that she honestly felt. And the campaign, internally, they were having a mini crisis about it. It happens on a Friday night, the news breaks of it. On Saturday morning, they jump on a conference call. They feel like they've handled it. Saturday leads into Sunday when Secretary Clinton has this fall at the 9/11 memorial. So that entire weekend is basically built around deplorables and then this fall and this looming issue about her health. And the health question feeds into an even larger narrative about, can you trust Hillary Clinton? Why isn't her campaign saying what happened here? Because it took them a while to actually come forward and say she had pneumonia. And that was, we find out in this book, because a lot of people were pointing the finger at the same time at Huma Abedin for not relaying the information that she was sick all week. And so a lot of her advisors were kind of caught off guard by that and didn't know how to respond to it. So you see what's happening kind of moment by moment here and how that, John and I never found any health issues, but I think, as I just said, I think what that health story led to was the bigger, well, what is she hiding? Why isn't she being upfront about this? And that hurt her. And that was at a really pivotal moment. It's September. We're less than 2 months away from the election. And that, I think that was a moment that hurt her for sure.
I think deplorables, is so at odds with her campaign slogan, stronger together. The idea of this inclusiveness versus deplorables. And look, Donald Trump said awful things, like during this campaign and obviously on videotape, and yet no one expected him to be a whole lot better than that in terms of his rhetoric. But for her, she's making the argument that you shouldn't vote for him because of the awful things he says. She's going to be inclusive. And here she is saying half the people voting for him are deplorable, and an even worse word in that same set of remarks, irredeemable. Which I think we were talking about Bill Clinton and the contrition cycle. For anybody that's familiar with redemption, the idea that somebody is irredeemable is kind of counter to pretty much every religion that I'm aware of, right? Like, this is not helpful for her in any way, shape, or form to talk about people like that.
And the image I always think of from Saturday Night Live is the debates when I can't remember who played Hillary Clinton, kind of gave the impression, the comedian, that I can't believe anyone is listening to this. I can't believe anyone would take this guy seriously. Not you, John, but Donald Trump. And
Kate McKinnon feels that way about it.
Was there an element of her that just didn't get what was going on, that kind of missed where the electorate was, where politics was moving, how dangerous this opponent was as a threat? Is that a kind of accurate?
Yes. We talk about one scene in the book where it's post-New Hampshire, so she's gotten trounced over there. She's on a plane. Huma Abedin essentially calls all these longtime friends of hers and invites them on a trip as sort of a cheer Hillary up kind of moment. So she's flying around with Mignon Moore, her longtime confidant, and she is confiding that she doesn't understand what's happening. She sees the rise in populism, doesn't get it, can't wrap her arms around it, and says as much, tells her in a moment, I'm seeing what's happening, I can't wrap my arms around it, I can't, and this is after New Hampshire, she's a year into her campaign. She sees what's happening with Bernie. She sees the excitement behind his campaign, and she's confused by it. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I do think that she, I'd like to think that she was a mismatched candidate for the time, that people were craving an outsider. People in Europe are craving the same thing. It's sort of this global phenomenon, and yet it's happening here. And Bill Clinton's always kind of concerned about what's happening over there in Brexit, and they don't think, for whatever reason, she doesn't quite understand it.
And then a few days before the election, she's talking to an aide and she says, I tend to bring out the worst in some people, and I don't know why that is, but it is. And the aide says, it's going to be worse in the White House. And she says, yeah, it's going to be worse than the White House. She thought she was going to win the presidency, but she also understood that there was a lot of anger toward her, and there was a lot of frustration. And so her own experience out there was, like us writing the book and seeing all these problems, somewhat at odds with the polling data we were seeing. You know, I mean, she understood that people were upset with her, so I don't think she couldn't put her finger on why.
Why? Could I ask you, I remember I went to see the movie about Anthony Weiner. I can't remember when it came out with my wife who's sitting up there. And I remember we walked out and I said, I can't believe that Hillary Clinton is just 2 steps away from someone who is politically problematic, right? Didn't I say that? And so my question, and it ended up being a problem. And my question isn't about that, and it's not about Comey, which I'm sure someone will ask. What is it about Hillary Clinton that can't see, as a seasoned, experienced, really brilliant person, that, you know, she surrounds herself with problems?
Well, let me come at it from a different angle. I think that people's sort of immutable characteristics are often both strengths and weaknesses. And one of her immutable characteristics is this deep belief in loyalty. And that can be a strong thing. Loyalty can be helpful in politics. It can be necessary in politics. And at the same time, it can be really destructive. And it can be destructive in that she requires loyalty, and some people won't tell her the truth because of it. And it can be destructive because it is two-way. Unlike some politicians who will throw their aide under the nearest bus as soon as necessary, she stuck with Huma Abedin. I think she felt, our sources told us, she felt sympathy and empathy for this woman who did, through no fault of her own other than marrying Anthony Weiner, was, you know, sort of, people were discussing whether she should leave her husband. I mean, Hillary Clinton's been through this before. And yet at the same time, as you point out, any normal politician would have thrown Huma Abedin off a campaign plane and never thought twice about it. But that is an immutable characteristic of Hillary Clinton's, this deep, abiding sense of loyalty. And I think that was what was at play. And as we report in the book, ultimately, she did decide to throw Huma off the campaign plane.
And Gal, you can, if you want to line up, I'm going to ask 2 more
Not
questions.
literally, by the way.
Right, no, right. We know that. That would be, right. There's going to be a fake news story any second now that she did that. The election night. You were there. You were at the Javits Center. You were in D.C.?
Yes.
What was it like in the campaign in those final hours as the realization came in that she had lost to Donald Trump?
It's funny. So early on, the mood there at the Javits Center was, I mean, people were ready for a historic moment.
Yep.
You saw her aides come out and talk to the press in the press file. By, I would say, like 9:30 or 10 o'clock, you couldn't find any one of her people anywhere. They had all disappeared. So I was messaging people and finding out what was going on behind the scenes. And around 10:30 or 11, I got kind of an alarming message from someone pretty high up that said, "We never saw this coming." It turns out that they weren't doing traditional in key states for the last few weeks.
To save money, right?
To save money. And that hurt them. But so it's funny. So there are people on the floor at the Javits Center. There is a boiler room in her Brooklyn headquarters. There is another boiler room in Midtown full of advisors, and then there is her hotel suite. So it's Secretary Clinton is there, President Clinton is there. Some of her very close aides like Robbie Mook and John Podesta. So they're all gathered and they see Florida coming in, and Florida isn't looking good. Bill Clinton's on the phone with one of his longtime advisors who basically says, yeah, this isn't going so well. Robbie Mook and Podesta are eventually, Robbie is briefing Secretary Clinton and saying, okay, let's hold on to North Carolina, let's hold on to hope in Pennsylvania. Those obviously don't go well. And so there's a dramatic shift. And meanwhile at Javits Center, people are looking, I have never seen a room of more disturbed, shocked. The entire room was just, there was a hush and people were just looking at the television monitors. It was really, it was something.
And she feels the weight of what this means at the end, you say.
Right, I mean, and I think that feeling sort of permeated the Democratic universe, wherever people were, this sort of like hushed silence, this sort of shattered feeling, right? But she's finding out that she's gonna lose, and President Obama in the White House has determined that she has lost. He and his political team have determined she's lost. And he has his political director, David Seamus, call Robbie Mook. And Seamus says to Mook, look, let's not drag this out. Trump has been talking about the legitimacy of the election. Let's not feed into any fears about this election not being legitimate. You know, she should get out there and concede. And Mook says, you know, she's not really ready to give a speech, which is kind of the fig leaf that they're using to keep going and continue a debate that they're having internally at the Clinton campaign headquarters and at in their boiler room, which is, do we go out and concede now, or do we wait and see if some of the, there are more ballots that come in from these states in the Midwest overnight, or could we have automatic recounts? There are people who are arguing strenuously that she should not concede, saying, like, we've been through Al Gore, we've been through close races, we should wait. President Obama's aide does not make the case effectively to Mook, who is obviously in this bad place between the president and the candidate. And so Obama calls Clinton and he says, look, you need to concede, kind of makes the same case that his aide had just made. He obviously doesn't think that he's done this effectively enough, because he then calls John Podesta, his own former aide, who is now Clinton's campaign chair. And Podesta is leaving the Javits Center, where he has just told America that they're going to wait until the morning. So no wonder the president thinks that maybe they didn't get the message. So he calls Podesta and he says, look, for the good of the country, you've got to get her out there. She's got to concede. And at this point, President Obama is playing as his role as President of the United States, responsible for the smooth and peaceful transfer of power and the legitimacy of American elections. And he makes that case to Podesta. And around the same time, Clinton is in her suite making the decision that she's going to cut off the debate among her aides. And so she cuts off the debate and basically says, give me the phone, I'm calling him. Huma Abedin calls Kellyanne Conway. Clinton gets on the phone with Trump. Clinton says those two words she thought she would never say. Congratulations, Donald. They have a 1-minute conversation. He tells her she ran a good race. She gets off the phone with him. She goes back to her dining room table in her suite with her aides around her. Chelsea Clinton's there to look at her concession speech, which she's now going to give the next morning. She looks at it for the first time. She did not look it over earlier in the night. She had gone over the victory speech. She'd edited it with her aides earlier in the evening. Now she's looking at the concession speech for the first time. And Huma Abedin walks up with a phone extended and says, it's the president. And this is the moment, and I'm sorry, this was a long-winded answer to your question, but this is the moment where she realizes it's a consolation call. The President of the United States calling the losing nominee for president. And she doesn't want to take it. She winces, visibly, her face just kind of, and she retracts from the phone a little bit. She realizes that she's let herself down, and she's let her party down. She believes she's let the country down in Donald Trump becoming president, and she thinks she's let President Obama down. She's somebody who consistently said through the campaign, both publicly and privately, that she felt he'd done a lot better job than he got credit for. And now she was the person who was in charge of safeguarding his legacy and extending it, and she felt like she'd let him down. And she puts the phone, finally reluctantly takes the phone, she puts it to her ear, and she says, Mr. President, I'm sorry.
With that, we're going to start with some questions. I have more comments, but I want to leave the floor. So come to the mic so we can hear. We'll start on this side. Sorry, that was a great answer. Yeah, great story.
Hi. Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation and for writing your book, which I haven't read yet, so sorry if this is in it. everything you've said so far, I've learned more than I knew from reading the papers and things, but it sounds like no more anarchic than a normal election, a normal campaign. So I want to go back to one of the things you mentioned earlier, which you've mentioned a couple of times, which is about the data. So why she was so confident she was so far ahead. And here in Princeton, I heard a talk in about September where one of her micro-targeting people saying, our numbers are so much better than the numbers you guys are seeing in the papers. And I thought, okay, I'm a computer scientist, not a statistician, but I thought, how can that be, right? Because the numbers in the papers are based on quite a large N, and how could that be? If there was a point where the Russians were going to hack and nobody was looking, would it be the Democrats' internal numbers? I mean, how could they be that far off that they weren't being more careful?
So, I wish that I was a cybersecurity expert, because it seems like that would be effective and helpful in political reporting now. I think their numbers were so far off because there was a hidden Trump vote. I mean, more than anything else. And in fact, we have in the book, this was not reported during the campaign, but one of Clinton's top advisors had said early on, maybe it was March or April, May of 2015, had written a memo that said, fact, Donald Trump could be elected president of the United States. And one of the bullet points was, I would add 3 points to any poll you see. Add 3 or 4 points to Trump for any poll you see. I think there was a hidden Trump vote. I think that basically there were people who were shy Trump voters, or the difference of people answering the phone or not answering the phone. Everybody was off by a similar margin. And by the way, the national polling was not that far off. I mean, from a statistical point of view, it really wasn't that far off. And it didn't have to be that far off in the states. If you are running a statewide campaign in Virginia, which is close every time, and you go in and you're up 2 points on election day, you don't feel comfortable at up 2 points or even up 3 or 4 points. You feel 12 points. So it's not that shocking that in any individual state or a couple of states where maybe the movement of independence is more toward one side or the other, that they kind of reflect each other and all move in the same direction. Sorry, that wasn't a computer science answer, but.
My compliments to you. For those of us who miss spending our evenings with Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow and Anderson Cooper, Shattered is very, very comforting. I even find myself rereading chapters because I like going back and seeing even the reruns. I have a fundamental question to see if any of the campaign staffers addressed anything with you regarding some deeper information about the superdelegate system, in that progressives were very turned off when they learned about pre-pledged superdelegates. For example, here in New Jersey, Senator Booker pre-pledged before the primary even came to New Jersey. And that is not just about Hillary Clinton, but it's about the Democratic National Committee. And did anyone address that type of issue with you about the pre-pledged delegate problem? Thank you.
It wasn't something that we were talked to a lot about for this book, but it's something that I think we understand and we've watched a lot and we've talked a lot about in terms of the overall process. And I think that, number one, we make the point that superdelegates getting out there early has an effect on voters and the perception of who's leading. And obviously, because with the superdelegates, you're more likely to win a nomination. Our last book, we wrote about a loyalty list, a hit list that Hillary Clinton kept of Democrats from the 2008 campaign she felt had betrayed her. And there was a little bit of a chilling effect, I think, put on a lot of Democrats. They all jumped out very quickly to support her this time. What?
Claire McCaskill was
Claire McCaskill was one of them. But one thing I would say on the superdelegate question, before there were superdelegates, the elected officials would run as delegates, run as regular. I mean, the reason for the superdelegates being created was that all the delegates were already elected officials, so this was a way to get more people into the process. I'm not saying that the system as it currently exists is the best one, but it's just worth remembering that, if you were to get rid of the superdelegates, you would either have members of Congress running as regular delegates, or you would have to exempt them from being able to do that. My guess is that Democrats over the next election cycle or two are really going to look at their rules and attempt to make it easier for more people to run and try to change the way their delegate rules change who their delegate rules favor. But it's complicated politics, because right now it's helpful to some people and hurtful to others.
First, thank you for adding this extra layer of human, emotional part of the campaign. It was very interesting. But what, for me, and for a lot of people I think that's missing, is that they ran a campaign by the books. And yes, they made mistakes. Every campaign, Obama's both runs had mistakes. But they were running a traditional campaign on a plan that had worked for decades for a lot of politicians. When people analyze why Trump voters voted as they did, and you dig into the detail, most of it is because they have beliefs, huge beliefs about catastrophic, horrible things that Hillary Clinton's supposedly responsible for doing that are not based on any fact. There has never been an election like that. And couldn't you have taken almost any Democrat, Bernie Sanders or anyone else, and put them up against what were 8 years in the making of ingrained misbeliefs about atrocities that were associated with her because she was the obvious heir and apparent? Wasn't there more to it than, she wasn't likable, or she had a screechy voice, or whatever people attributed, or whether she had the wrong people around her? Would it have mattered in the end because of what people believe?
That's a really good question, because, as I said before, I feel like this was the cycle of the outsider, even more so than 2008. So a lot of people, John and I were talking to someone the other day who pointed to France and said, look at these two candidates, they're both outsiders. So a lot of people have made the case to us that Bernie Sanders would have been better equipped to take on Donald Trump because there was this excitement and energy behind him, and he really appealed to the base. And at the end of the day, I think they were counting on the base coming home. And on the Republican side, you saw them do that more than I think people expected. So it is an interesting case, I think, there is something to be said for that. And I do think that in a lot of ways, she was mismatched for this time, that with all her baggage and all of that, people were looking for someone different. And I think, one of her biggest problems, I think, and we make this case in the book, was that he had a message. He had something kind of that people could latch onto. When you talk to people on November 6th, 7th, 8th, they could tell you what he was about. They could tell you that he wanted to make America great again. They could tell you that he wanted to build a wall. When you look at her, even though she was for so many things, I don't think people had that tangible thing to latch onto and say, this is why she should be president. Right. And I think at the end of the day, that hurt her. Mm-hmm. The fact that no one could really say, okay, well, she's Hillary Clinton, but then what? I think that was a big factor.
But also, if somebody ran 25 years of negative against me, I wouldn't do very well in an election.
So there have been a lot of books like this of inside stories of campaigns, but I don't think that Haleman and Halprin had suddenly all of the emails of one of the principals they're writing about suddenly get revealed. So I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about, first of all, how did the revelation of their boss's emails affect people working on the Clinton campaign, and also if you could talk a little bit about how did that affect your reporting? I mean, in the middle of writing this book, suddenly you realize that all of the sort of interesting details that you're excited to write about, people are getting for free anyway.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Number one, I think they actually handled it pretty well, given that they could all read each other's emails. I mean, that could have been a destructive moment. We do have a scene in the book where Jake Sullivan, who was promoted from policy director to chief strategist, is walking with John Podesta in the New York City subway system, and somebody runs up to Podesta because he recognizes him, and pardon my French here. Are there young people here? Can I speak in French here?
There
are. But at any rate,
Sullivan's I'm really curious.
My kids don't care.
Sullivan sees this and he's like, fuck, if people are recognizing John Podesta in the subway, this thing has gotten too big. This is a problem. John Podesta should not be recognized. We were working on a book, and then all of a sudden there were 50,000 or however many emails that John Podesta had out there in the world. And the thing is, you would think oh, this is a great research tool and such a wonderful opportunity to dig through these things. And the answer is no, like this is not like a great research tool and an awesome opportunity to dig through these things, because it just meant more stuff we had to read while we were trying to write the book, and more stuff that we had to defend against in terms of, you want to go through all of them to make sure that nothing that anybody told you is contradicted by what's in the emails, and if it is, to try to reconcile those things, because it could be that what's in the email isn't true. Not that it's a fake email, not that the Russians inserted something fake, but that somebody was lying in email to somebody else. That happens all the time. Happens every day, I bet, even here on this campus. But what we were able to use it for more than anything was to take things that were told and in a few occasions find a more rich or like easier to use detail than what we had. So like somebody would have told us like, oh, there's a bunch of campaign infighting about X thing, and this was really bad, and it did this, sort of was a Y problem for this many days. And you go and you see the emails, and you're like, oh, I see, that's the email that started it. Like, we ought to use that because it explains this whole thing in one email instead of the 13 pages we would use writing around it. And by the way, we're already like 400 pages, so, at Princeton people might read that much, but a lot of other places not so much.
But it is hard to write a campaign book. I remember I talked to Evan Thomas once, and he said he used to do for Newsweek those, and it was getting hard, and this was in the age of Politico when it started, and you guys were both there, because there was so much kind of instant and ongoing reporting of a campaign. You felt like you knew the inside by the time it was over. You didn't really need the behind the scenes.
And we worried about that.
Right, and you have that, and then you have on top of it now this era of email dumps and everything. I mean, it must be hard to write a campaign book that will still capture the imagination, which this has, with all that information out there already.
Yeah, I think John and I, when the emails were being released, we had conversations like, shit, is this gonna be the end of our book? I mean, are all these emails gonna be out there? Is everyone gonna know what happened? But actually, as John said, we found that they enriched our details already, and we had a few aha moments actually in going through them, because we had talked to a few sources who had talked about a certain thing, and then there was the email that explained it, and so I think it added a depth.
They only run through about mid-March of 2015, so like, if you were relying upon them, like the first couple chapters of mid-March of 2016, the first few chapters would be like really like a lot better, but the rest of the book would stink.
Hey, didn't we end up with like emails about them choosing a vice presidential nominee? That's like later than that, right?
It's like right at the end. It's like the Podesta sends email to Clinton on like March 17th or something with the first list,
right,
which is like of vice presidential possibilities, which is like 30 people categorized by race and gender.
Yeah, so going back to the reason Robbie Mook was hired in the first place, how realistic was Secretary Clinton's assessment that it was really the data operations of Barack Obama's campaign that was responsible for her loss? Or was that some kind of rationalization to gloss over what might have been other major problems in her campaign?
I mean, one of the takeaways from this book is that Clinton has difficulty blaming herself, or looking at herself and saying, I mean, look, she said this during the campaign, and I think it was one of the more endearing moments when she said, look, I'm not a natural politician. I mean, she gets that at some level, but she's not one to look around and go like, not only am I going to blame myself, but I'm going to let other people blame me by blaming myself publicly. So, I think that she did not appreciate the degree to which she lost to Barack Obama because Barack Obama was a better candidate. And all these other things were part of that, were both symptomatic and causal of him being a better candidate, but that ultimately he was just a better candidate than she was.
And we're often asked why did she like him so much? And I think a lot of that is because she likes seeing things in front of her. She likes evidence, and he likes evidence. And so there was kind of a mind meld in that way, where she saw a bit of her, I think, herself in him. And I think that was a big part of it. And we dug deep on why she picked him, and I think that was one of the reasons. And that's why we were asked earlier, why did she listen to her husband? And I think that's a big part of it.
Can I push back a second? So the other way to think about it is Donald Trump ran a horrendous campaign as well. So I understand he speaks from the gut and he can do, but it was, I mean, if you wanted to model all the things not to do, including the distribution, it wasn't his fault, but, well, it was his fault, but the release of a tape with him saying what he did with Access Hollywood, kind of totally chaotic campaign where no one was running the show, saying everything wrong a million times to subvert his own success. Kind of why didn't it affect him? He had, on paper, he was not a great candidate.
It did affect him. He just didn't lose. I mean, you watched her numbers get up to like 7, 8, 9 points after the debates. She started to take off after the debates. She'd have been ahead pretty much the entire campaign. She takes off after the debates, and she just doesn't break his back, right? There's never a point at which he's not kind of in it, hanging around. Like if you guys watch Princeton play basketball against Penn or something, and Princeton should be winning, but like at halftime they've outplayed Penn and they're only up 4. And you're like, why are they only up 4? And like, I know they're gonna lose, and then they end up losing. I sort of feel like that's what the Clinton-Trump kind of situation was, right?
Yeah.
And then you've lost to Penn, and you're like, God, we lost to Penn. Mm-hmm. How did we lose to Penn? I'm sorry?
Princeton was undefeated, he said. Yeah.
Previous years.
Thank you. My question is actually similar to the point that you just raised, Professor Zelzer. You spoke earlier about how the campaign didn't really expect that the email concern would last for the entire cycle. So how did you guys, in writing the book, and how should we, and how should a campaign filter out between what matters, what's just kind of noise and isn't going to have an impact, and then the distinction between what matters to voters versus just, blue check marks on Twitter?
Blue check marks on Twitter. Wow, dissing the elitists with an elitist diss. I like that.
I would love to have a blue check mark, so it's not like a...
Do you want
to take it and then I'll take it?
So it's a great question because the beautiful thing is that we'll never really be able to explain why 130 million people vote the way that they do. I mean, there is a limitation on our understanding that. We can try a million different ways, and the truth of it is, like, a fair amount of people are voting on the cut of someone's jib, for lack of a better term, right? They'll tell you that they think they're voting for someone for one reason, and they're voting for them for some other reason. Or they'll say, I just can't stand the way her voice sounds or whatever, or they'll say, and like, you're like, that person's never going to vote for Hillary Clinton. There is like such a deeper set of things going on.
There was misogyny too.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, that's like sort of a misogynistic, like,
right.
The person that says that is never going to vote for her, right? Unless they're a Democrat, in which case they might because they like the Democrat versus the Republican. We have all these different things that make us vote the way that we do, and it's impossible to really go through everybody, but I think we can make pretty good conclusions about a lot of it based on sort of large swings of people in one direction or another in terms of what seems to be effective, in terms of using science to the extent that it is usable. And by the way, I mean, you guys probably know better than anyone. You and I can use the same statistic to make exactly opposite arguments about something. So that's my answer, is that, like, we don't have a perfect answer for which of these things act in which ways on the result, but we have a pretty good amount of information about it.
I would agree. And I think when we were doing this book, I mean, people often ask us, well, wasn't it Russia and Comey? And the answer is yes, but the answer is when she won by less than 80,000 votes, or lost by less than 80,000 votes, and when you factor in all of these things, from message to the fact that she was the wrong candidate for this time, and populism and all that, and Bernie Sanders and what he did to her campaign, and all these other factors, I think every one of these things matters, and she was supposed to blow him away. That's one thing that people fail to realize even now, I think, that she even mentions at one point, why am I not up by 50 points? And I think a lot of people thought that she should be. And so I think all of these things contributed to it. And so it's not one thing or the other. It's Comey, Russia, and all of these other things.
But also to pick up on that just real briefly, Jim Comey does not exist in our consciousness, but for the email server that contained classified information on it outside the government system. And the FBI director had to investigate that. And Jim Comey doesn't jump into the spotlight if not for Bill Clinton meeting with Loretta Lynch on a tarmac. And if Donald Trump, if Melania Trump had done that with Boris Kislyak or anybody else from Russia over the last couple of weeks, Democrats would be going absolutely nuts. So, I mean, these are things that force Jim Comey into the spotlight. He does not exist but for those things in terms of the presidential sphere. And when we talk about Russia, we knew about Russian interference before the election. This is a campaign that failed to take 17 US intelligence agencies saying that Russia had interfered on behalf of Donald Trump, failed to make that enough of an election issue to defeat him.
And she failed to make it.
Right. I mean, she said it in debates. She called him a Russian puppet in a debate and spent a good bit of a debate trying to make the case that people shouldn't vote for him because he was too close to Russia. It didn't work. It's not that Russia came up after the election. We have more detail now, but it's not like that was something new.
And they seized upon, there was one debate where she could have taken it to Russia post-debate, and they instead chose to make it about Alicia Machado, the person that she threw out in the debate. They had practiced this, obviously. It was a pre-packaged line, but the one that was Miss Piggy and Miss Housekeeping, that was their campaign narrative for the following week. It wasn't Russia. So there were missed opportunities along the way.
So returning to the primary, had Bernie done somewhat better with Black and Hispanic voters, he might well have been the nominee. And so we saw this division between sort of the economic populism and which associated with Bernie and sort of more multiculturalism, which associated with Hillary. And do you think that's going to be a divide going forward for the party, or is it just a function of Hillary being a woman, Hillary having worked for the administration of the first Black president, or do you see this as a division in the Democratic Party going forward? And sort of given your answer to that, who do you think of as the most effective nominee in 2020?
The most popular question we get.
So if I write the thesis on that, can I get a degree from here? Do you want to start?
Where to begin? I think a lot of it is a lot of it is her baggage. It is misogyny. It is all these things. I think they need to find a candidate that appeals more to the time and the base. And I just don't think she was that person. And I think we build the case in this book. And I think a lot of people know at this point that Bernie Sanders could have done a little better in bringing those people home. So I think what you're seeing is, I think they're going to need to do some soul searching going forward on who can attract those people. And I think a lot of women are actually coming forward, like you see Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar and some other people that can make the case and appeal to those demographics. So I think, yeah, they need to figure that out. But I think the one thing they learned is that you can't really just because everyone felt like it was her time and she had done her time and waited and done all the work for President Obama. I think people realize now that you can't just have some anointed person come forward and be that person.
And yes, this is going to continue to be a problem for the Democrats. It was a problem before. Under President Obama, I think that the frustration of African American voters over a Democratic platform that was not necessarily always as sensitive to issues of people of color having opportunity, economic opportunity, and social issues, I think that was suppressed. I think the frustration was suppressed. You heard it a lot on Capitol Hill over the years, where members of Congress would say the president is talking about being sort of colorblind and a rising tide lifts all boats, and what he's not doing is addressing things that are going on in my community that need to be addressed and obstacles that need to be addressed. And I think when Hillary Clinton was the nominee, naturally some of that frustration came forth that had been sort of suppressed in favor of President Obama. And so the best candidate is the one that, as Amie was saying, is able to, bridge those divides. But I don't think that's going anywhere. I think that there is a real serious divide in the party over those things.
Sir, I would ask different question. Was America ready for having a president women? Talking back into history, I think our women were not always equipped in the same laws and protection as they were in different countries. And I think we are still not ready, and doesn't matter what kind. Talking, who is president now, is a typical American egotic man. His government is practically, I don't know, has one female, yeah? His government. And I think this factor was decisive in her unhappy, result.
More people voted for Hillary Clinton than any Republican in American history, than any Republican presidential candidate in American history. She got 3 million more votes than, and this is something we haven't said here, she got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did. The election was so close that I don't believe that it is fair to judge from this election that America can't elect a woman president. I think there is a sliding scale. There is a gray scale for every voter on whether that is something that is a huge priority to elect a woman or something that they would never, ever do. And I think the candidate matters in terms of moving that gray scale for certain people to make it a little bit thicker, a little bit lighter. But you saw Clinton did worse in a state like Pennsylvania that has never elected a woman governor, never elected a woman to the United States Senate. She did worse among men than, not only worse among men than Barack Obama did, but a lot worse among men than Barack Obama did. So like, you can go state by state and see it's harder in some states, it's easier in other states. I think what we saw was a woman could win the presidency this time. Not this particular woman at this particular time in the particular states that mattered for the Electoral College. But if your hope is to see a woman elected president, I would say that this year should be encouraging, not discouraging.
My question is a little bit similar to his. If putting politics aside for a moment, if we can, and if it's possible putting aside the personal characteristics of the candidates, the fact in 2008, 2016 had a very, very deep resume, and you had 2 men candidates with, to put it generously, had a very thin resume, but the men won. Do you think this says anything about culture in the country now and also looking forward to the future, not just in politics, but in everything?
Maybe you kind of heard her talk about when she gave her interview a couple weeks ago to Christiane Amanpour and basically said, I was the more experienced one. I came prepared. I knew every policy nuance, and she's right. She did. And so I think that was a problem, and I think she knew it. There's a scene in the book that we talk about that kind of speaks to the moment and what she was feeling. And she's speaking to a veterans conference, and she has a moment where she realizes they're not connecting with her, and she goes off script and she tries to talk about the first female commander-in-chief and what that might be like. And she actually admits in the speech, I know it's uncomfortable for you, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm still coming to terms with it too. And just in that moment, you see what she's thinking, and you see that it's a very real thing that she's sort of addressing, and that maybe she feels like the country isn't ready for it. And she felt the need to kind of try that out in front of this particular audience.
Well, I was thinking not just in politics, in many other aspects of the culture in the country.
Yeah.
I mean, if the question is, like, does the United States still have sexism, and does it, I mean, yeah, like, yes, obviously.
Yes.
And like I was saying before, there's kind of a gray scale here. Like, I think a woman could be elected president of the United States. I think it's a little harder. Shirley Chisholm once said that of being African American and being a woman, she faced more challenges as a woman than being African American. All that said, John McCain beat Barack Obama in 2008, and John McCain had a much better resume than Barack Obama, and I don't think that was based on gender. I mean, McCain was a prisoner of war. He was a Senate Armed Services Committee
Barack Obama
chairman.
beat John McCain.
I'm sorry, Barack Obama beat John McCain. But you get my point that McCain was by far, had a deeper resume. I just don't think running on your resume is a great plan as a presidential candidate.
I think one of the more interesting takeaways, too, is that millennial women didn't feel the need to support her because they feel like, and I wrote a bunch of stories about this as it was happening, but it was so interesting to me because when you talk to them, they felt like they would eventually see a woman president in their lifetime, so they didn't feel the need to vote for this particular woman. And that, to me, says a lot about her and everything else.
I'll take one final question from the audience.
Well, I'm feeling lucky. I have so many comments, but I will ask the question. What do you think happened to the educated voter? Why did they not support Hillary, whether they be white educated men, white educated women, or the educated at all? Because I think they were the secret sauce for Trump, and I don't know what your thoughts are, so that's really the question.
I mean, from a percentage level, the educated voters went with her. Yeah. I would have to check to look at how they did versus what they did for Obama in 12 and 08. But it was really the less educated voters that were the sort of Trump sweet spot, or as John Favreau said the other day, a low information voter just became president. But look, I do think there were educated voters that voted for Donald Trump. I mean, there were definitely
there clearly are. I mean,
right.
I can't quote a statistic,
yeah.
But there were people who, like you said earlier, that either didn't answer the question correctly or didn't want to admit.
I think there are educated voters that just hate her. I think there are educated voters who believe that Trump would be better for their pocketbooks. I mean, there are any number of reasons to.
There are people who supported Bernie Sanders and not her. And I've spoken to a few of them since who just couldn't get there. They're Democrats, and they, for whatever reason, couldn't support her and get behind her. And I think that sort of speaks to some other questions here about speaking more to the base and the people who will turn out for you the way President Obama did.
And some of the shots at her that she was corrupt, I mean, those are aimed squarely at educated voters to say, wait a second, this one is more corrupt than the other ones, and that the things that she's doing are particularly corrupt. You have to be a pretty high information voter, I think, to start getting into the questions of like a foundation and how that might be. I mean, this is not something that the average person's spending a whole lot of time listening to. If you want to like look at the foundation and you want to look at donations to her campaigns and things she did as Secretary of State, like all that stuff, that's complicated stuff. I think that stuff was aimed at high information voters and educated voters.
You guys were still surprised on election night?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Shocked.
Yeah, I'm shocked.
Even knowing all this?
Yeah, it's funny. Our book editor, we turned in some chapters before the election, and he made some notes and circled a few things and said, you guys are pointing out all these problems in the campaign. How are you going to square this when she wins?
You had the last laugh, kind of.
But we were surprised because
yeah.
we were looking at the polling just like everybody else. I mean,
yeah.
I didn't think I had better information.
And the book was going to be called Shattered, I should mention. We get that question a lot. We thought that it would, when she shattered the glass ceiling, that would be a historic moment.
So so in terms, I want to wrap this up so you have time to meet both of them. And we have some wine and food outside. And they're there to sell books and sign books, and I urge you to get it. It's really a wonderful and very engaging account of the campaign that's hard to put down. It's a very good look at what the Democrats did wrong, which I think is a conversation that isn't as popular right now as some of the other issues that were at play. And finally, it's a kind of interesting look at how tactics and strategy can matter a great deal in campaigns. And sometimes it's not simply about the big stories about where the population is or the impulses of the electorate, but it's also just big mistakes like not polling enough in certain states to save money that can have a huge outcome for the nation. So please join me in thanking John and Amie. And they'll be outside. They'll sell, sign, shake your hand.